The Vietnam War remains a searing wound in the American psyche. It is a conflict that has left an indelible mark on the nation's history, culture, and collective memory. The war not only claimed the lives of over 58,000 American soldiers, but also left countless others physically and emotionally scarred. The impact of this war continues to reverberate through generations, shaping the way Americans view their government, military, and foreign policy. It was a conflict that divided a nation, pitted brother against brother, and created deep rifts within American society. Families were torn apart, friendships were tested, and the nation found itself in a state of turmoil. The anti-war movement gained momentum, with protests and demonstrations becoming a common sight across the country. The war became a focal point for a broader cultural and political upheaval, challenging the very fabric of American society, and cast a long shadow over American foreign policy. The decisions made during this era have had lasting implications, influencing how the United States approaches international conflicts to this day. The lessons learned, and in some cases not learned, from the Vietnam War continue to shape the strategies and policies of American leaders. To understand how the U.S. became embroiled in this Southeast Asian conflict, we must travel back to the ashes of World War II. The end of the war marked the beginning of a new global order, with former colonial empires crumbling and new nations emerging. Southeast Asia in particular became a hotbed of political and social change, as countries sought to assert their independence and define their futures. Post-war Europe was a continent in ruins, physically and ideologically. The devastation wrought by the war left cities in rubble and economies in shambles. Amidst this chaos, the ideological battle lines were drawn, setting the stage for a new kind of conflict. The struggle to rebuild and redefine national identities created a fertile ground for the spread of competing ideologies. From this wreckage, two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations, representing the polar extremes of capitalism and communism, quickly became locked in a struggle for global dominance. The Cold War, as it came to be known, was characterized by a series of proxy wars, espionage, and a constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The world watched with bated breath as these two titans, each espousing vastly different ideologies, locked horns in what became known as the Cold War. This period of intense geopolitical tension saw both superpowers vying for influence and control over various regions around the globe. The stakes were incredibly high, as each side sought to expand its ideological reach and prevent the other from gaining an upper hand. At the heart of this standoff lay the domino theory. This theory, which became a cornerstone of American foreign policy, suggested that the fall of one nation to communism would inevitably trigger a chain reaction, leading to the communist domination of entire regions. The fear was that if one country in a region fell under communist control, neighboring countries would quickly follow suit, much like a row of falling dominoes. This theory, embraced by U.S. policymakers, posited that the fall of one nation to communism would inevitably trigger a chain reaction, leading to the communist domination of entire regions. The domino theory became a driving force behind many of the United States' foreign policy decisions during the Cold War, as leaders sought to contain the spread of communism at all costs. Vietnam, a former French colony struggling for independence, became a testing ground for this theory. The Vietnamese people, led by figures such as Ho Chi Minh, were determined to break free from colonial rule and establish their own nation. This struggle for independence was seen by the United States as a critical front in the battle against communism. The U.S., determined to contain the spread of communism, saw Vietnam as a crucial battleground. The strategic importance of Vietnam in the broader context of the Cold War cannot be overstated. Its location in Southeast Asia made it a key point of contention, as both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to exert their influence over the region. The stage was set for a long and bloody conflict, one that would test the limits of American military might and resolve. The Vietnam War would become one of the most challenging and controversial conflicts in American history, raising questions about the nation's role in the world and the true cost of war. This was a war fought not for territory, but for ideology, a war that would have far-reaching consequences for both Vietnam and the United States. The ideological battle between communism and capitalism played out on the battlefields of Vietnam, with each side determined to prove the superiority of its system. A war that would have far-reaching consequences for both Vietnam and the United States. The scars of this conflict are still visible today, in the landscapes of Vietnam and in the hearts and minds of those who lived through it. The Vietnam War serves as a stark reminder of the complexities and costs of war, and the enduring impact it can have on nations and individuals alike. America's involvement in Vietnam was a gradual slide into a quagmire. What began as a seemingly small commitment would eventually spiral into one of the most contentious and costly conflicts in American history. It all started with financial and military aid to the French, who were desperately trying to maintain their colonial grip on Vietnam. The French had been in Vietnam since the 19th century, and their control was being fiercely contested by the Viet Minh, a communist-led nationalist movement. When the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, it marked a turning point. The US, fearing the spread of communism, stepped in to fill the void. The defeat was a significant blow to French colonial ambitions, and a signal to the US that more direct intervention might be necessary to prevent a communist takeover. President Eisenhower, a staunch Cold Warrior, committed to supporting the fledgling government of South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Eisenhower believed that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would follow, like a row of dominoes. The US poured in money, weapons, and military advisors, believing that a communist Vietnam would be a disaster for Southeast Asia and a blow to American prestige. The initial support was intended to stabilize the region and build a strong anti-communist government in South Vietnam. The domino theory was in full effect, driving US policy and deepening its involvement in the region. This theory suggested that the fall of one nation to communism would lead to the fall of its neighbors, creating a chain reaction that could threaten global stability. However, Diem's government was riddled with corruption and inefficiency, failing to garner the support of the South Vietnamese people. Diem's oppressive policies and favoritism towards the Catholic minority alienated the largely Buddhist population, leading to widespread discontent. This lack of popular support created a vacuum that the communist Viet Cong, backed by North Vietnam, were quick to exploit. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics and had significant support from the local population, making them a formidable force against the South Vietnamese government and its American allies. As the Viet Cong insurgency gained momentum, the US found itself increasingly drawn into the conflict. What started as a mission to provide support and stability turned into a full-scale military engagement. The US began to send more troops, and the war escalated, leading to a prolonged and bloody conflict that would last for years. By the mid-1960s, the US had committed hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam. The war became a central issue in American politics and society, sparking widespread protests and debates about the country's role in the world. The quagmire deepened, and the cost in human lives and resources continued to mount. The Vietnam War left an indelible mark on American history, shaping the nation's foreign policy and its perception of military intervention. It was a conflict that tested the limits of American power and raised profound questions about the country's values and objectives on the global stage. The early 1960s saw a dramatic escalation of US involvement in Vietnam. President John F. Kennedy, initially hesitant to commit ground troops, authorized a surge in military advisors and financial aid. The US military, confident in its technological superiority, believed it could easily defeat the Viet Cong. However, the Vietnam War was unlike any conflict the US had fought before. The dense jungles and unfamiliar terrain negated much of the US military's technological advantage. The Viet Cong, masters of guerrilla warfare, used the terrain to their advantage, melting into the countryside after hit-and-run attacks. As the conflict escalated, so too did the human cost. American soldiers, many of whom were young draftees, found themselves thrust into a brutal and unforgiving war. The Viet Cong, fighting for their homeland and ideology, proved to be a tenacious and resourceful enemy. The US, despite its superior firepower, was struggling to adapt to the realities of jungle warfare. The Tet Offensive of 1968 proved to be a turning point in the Vietnam War, both militarily and politically. This series of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces marked a significant escalation in the conflict. On the Vietnamese New Year's holiday, Tet, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, launched a coordinated surprise attack on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. This bold move was intended to incite rebellion among the South Vietnamese population and encourage the United States to scale back its support of the Saigon regime. The offensive, while ultimately repelled by US and South Vietnamese forces, shattered the illusion of American progress in the war. Despite the heavy losses inflicted on the Communist forces, the sheer scale and intensity of the attacks caught the American military and public off guard. The American public, accustomed to optimistic reports from the Johnson administration, was shocked by the ferocity and scope of the Tet Offensive. The stark contrast between the administration's assurances and the reality of the situation on the ground became glaringly apparent. Television screens were filled with images of the fighting in Saigon, including the iconic image of a Viet Cong soldier being executed at point-blank range. This image, broadcasted into millions of American homes, became a symbol of the brutal and chaotic nature of the conflict. The Tet Offensive exposed the credibility gap between the Johnson administration's claims of progress and the reality on the ground. This gap eroded trust in the government and its handling of the war. Public support for the war plummeted as more and more Americans began to question the purpose and morality of the conflict, fueling the growing anti-war movement. Protests and demonstrations against the war became more frequent and widespread, reflecting the deepening divisions within American society. The offensive, a military defeat for the Communists, was a strategic victory, shaking American confidence and resolve. The psychological impact of the Tet Offensive was profound, leading many to believe that the war was unwinnable and that a new approach was needed. In the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, the Johnson administration was forced to reevaluate its policies and strategies in Vietnam. The pressure to find a way out of the conflict grew stronger, leading to significant changes in U.S. military and diplomatic efforts. Peace talks began to take on greater urgency, as both sides sought a way to end the prolonged and costly war. The Tet Offensive had fundamentally altered the course of the Vietnam War, leaving an indelible mark on American history and public opinion. The legacy of the Tet Offensive continues to be felt today, as it serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities and challenges of war, and the importance of understanding the true nature of a conflict before becoming deeply involved. The Vietnam War was not a conventional conflict with clear front lines and decisive battles. It was a grueling war of attrition, fought in the shadows and rice paddies, a stark contrast to the large-scale battles of World War II. The U.S. military, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt to the realities of fighting a determined and elusive enemy. The Viet Cong, deeply embedded within the local population, employed guerrilla tactics with deadly effectiveness. They would ambush U.S. patrols, plant booby traps, and disappear into the jungle before American firepower could be brought to bear. The constant threat of attack took a heavy toll on the morale of U.S. soldiers. The U.S. military, frustrated by the enemy's elusiveness, resorted to increasingly destructive tactics. Carpet bombing, napalm strikes, and the use of Agent Orange, a powerful defoliant, became commonplace, devastating the Vietnamese landscape and leaving a legacy of environmental and human suffering.